All right. Thanks, everyone, for coming. We have a nice big crowd today. Appreciate y'all being here. I'm not going to say any more announcements because you heard it all from Brian, so we'll just go ahead and get started. I'm Carrie Bourne. I'm from the Office of Continuing Education at UW-Whitewater, and we host the Fairhaven Lecture Series here at Fairhaven Senior Services. This fall, we'll celebrate 40 years doing the lecture series. And the series was actually started in the Political Science Department, now known as the Department of Politics, Government, and Law. So we have one of those folks from that department, so that this series originated there. So we know that that lectures about politics are always very, very what's the word I'm looking for? Appropriate, sure. You well received, whatever. Anyway, so we're happy to have one of those faculty here today, and that is Jonah Ralston. He's an associate professor in the Department of Politics, Government, and Law at UW-Whitewater and coordinator of the university's Public Policy and Administration program. Prior to his current academic appointment, he was employed as a program analyst for a nonpartisan legislative service agency in the state of Wisconsin, and before beginning his doctoral studies, he spent 3 years working as a business analyst with the Boeing Company. His academic credentials include a PhD from Michigan State University in political science, a master's degree in international affairs from Washington University in St. Louis, and a bachelor's degree in economics and finance from Illinois State University. He currently lives with his wife and 2 children in Fort Atkinson. Please welcome Dr. Jonah Ralston.
Well, thank you, Carrie, for that nice introduction. Hopefully this lecture is impressive as the bio sounded. And thank you all for coming. It's a pretty interesting topic, particularly as midterms are around the corner, right? So it's probably politics may be on your mind. So we can hopefully talk about some historical context for the state of Wisconsin. And how we'll start out is we'll first kind of set the stage for the progressive movement, right? Because you have to understand what was going on in the country that led to this movement in the first place. And so you had a changing America after the Civil War. So really what was happening is we were going from these artisan, handmade items to large-scale manufacturing and factories. We were going from, small, kind of self-sufficient farming families to people moving to the cities for work. And you can see in the graphic I've put there, if you look at the urban-rural population during the time period that we're going to be interested in, you could see that the blue line is the urban population, the rural is the red, and by 1920, there were more people living in cities in the United States than there were people living in rural communities. And that was a huge shift, right? And it also had tremendous impacts on politics, as you might imagine. We also had the rise of corporations, the development of the stock market, things like this. And with these large corporations came things like monopolies, right, where you had trusts, like Standard Oil Trust, right? You had these big names like the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts. And unfortunately, during this time period, the working conditions were quite poor. There wasn't a standard 40-hour work week. Most people were working 60 hours and more, and they were living in pretty squalid conditions. And there was a lot of inequality, rampant inequality. So there was a small number of people that were really the beneficiaries of this new industrial system, and then there were the rest, right? The working class, who were often quite poor. We had some big developments technologically during this time period. One was the Transcontinental Railroad, which connected the East Coast with the West Coast. And the railroad companies were also very big, powerful corporations during this time period. But what was interesting about the Transcontinental Railroad is it allowed a lot of westward expansion. So this country is getting larger. Problems are becoming more complex, right? So keep that in mind, that there begins to be a realization that maybe there's a role for government to do more, right? And that's kind of the seeds of progressivism. And then we have a lot of immigration, which also created a lot of tensions and really had an influence on politics as well. So you had millions of people, for example, coming from Europe to seek opportunities in the United States. So the Gilded Age is where we start, and that's the late 1800s. So the Gilded Age is a time period in which you have kind of laissez-faire government regulation, meaning allow businesses to do what they want, right? Allowed to do is kind of the French translation even. And so the federal government rarely intervenes during this time period to regulate business. And in fact, you had them really just intervening on behalf of business, right? So they would put down labor strikes, for example. Now, of course, the real famous one is the Pullman Strike in 1894. That's in our backyard, right? That happened in Chicago. And what happened there is, as there was an economic recession, George Pullman, who owned the Pullman Company, cut wages, but this was a company town. So when he cut wages, he didn't cut rents, he didn't cut prices for items that the employees could buy. So they felt sandwiched, right? They're making less money, but yet their rent is the same, and so they're being squeezed. So they went on strike, and it was a national strike, in fact. And Eugene Debs, who was a socialist, was the leader of the movement for this. Eventually, the federal government sends in the military to break this strike. So that gives you an idea of where the federal government was at this time, right? They weren't regulating on behalf of the working class. They were actually often working on behalf of the industrialists, right? Okay, so you have this lack of social welfare. You really don't have much redistribution at the time. And so wealth really became concentrated. And many of the people who were the beneficiaries of this wealth had read Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, and they saw this kind of like social Darwinism concept, right? As well, really, it's just natural selection. It's fitting that we're on top, right? That's just how it should be. A small number end up, making it through the process, and that's us. So they thought this was actually a natural arrangement. Most of the people in the country would have disagreed at the time, right? Again, there's widespread poverty. There is a lot of political corruption, and I'll show you a graphic that kind of speaks to that. And there were a lot of these labor strikes, as I already had mentioned. So there's a lot of unrest in the country. But you wouldn't gather that from the words of some of these industrialists, right? And I'm using the nice term here, right? In the time, what would these be called? Well, people would have called them robber barons, right? They had these very pejorative terms for these folks, right? But you have Andrew Carnegie, for example, and I'm sure we're all familiar with the Carnegie name. Here's what he wrote in 1889. So again, this is right during the Gilded Age. We accept and welcome, as conditions to which we must accommodate ourselves, great inequality of environment, the concentration of business, industrial, and commercial in the hands of a few. This, then, is held to be the duty of the man of wealth, to provide moderately for the legitimate wants of those dependent upon him, and after doing so, consider all surplus revenues which come to him simply as trust funds, which he is called upon to administer, and strictly bound as a matter of duty to administer in the manner in which, in his judgment, is best calculated to produce the most beneficial results for the community. The man of wealth thus becoming the mere agent and trustee for his poorer brethren, bringing to their service his superior wisdom, experience, and ability to administer, doing for them better than they would or could do for themselves. Now, that is very elitist, okay? I don't think I need to tell you that, right? That's obviously a very paternalistic view. It's also a very condescending view, right? Like, he sees himself as better than the people who work for him, right? So that view was obviously, because Carnegie had done a lot of philanthropy as well, right? So this is a pretty prevalent view, then, you can imagine, amongst this time period for these elites. Now, on the other hand, this comes from 1889 as well. The people didn't see it that way, that these were mere trustees that were working on behalf of the people, right, because they couldn't do it themselves. In fact, what they saw it as was as corruption, that these large trusts were in fact influencing politics and they were doing it on behalf of themselves, not on behalf of the people, right? And so this graphic here is a political cartoon that shows you the large trust, and there's the Senate floor, and it's called the Bosses of the Senate. And if you look, it says entrance for monopolists up in the corner right here, right? And that's where they're all coming in. They're in money bags. See that? It's a pretty great graphic. All right, now if you look up here, it says this is a Senate of the monopolists, by the monopolists, and for the monopolists. And then if you look up here in the little area here, it says the people's interest closed. Okay, and so this was the viewpoint of many of the people at the time, right? They didn't see this as these companies were working on behalf of them. They saw this as these companies working against them, right, for their own interests. So that's kind of the stage. And here are the conditions. So we have to, this is the last part of the stage, which is really what are the conditions for the people that are living at this time period, the majority of Americans that are alive at this time. So when we look at the conditions, you see that workplace accidents were extremely common. So you had 35,000 workers a year being killed in work-related accidents. And you have to remember, this is a much smaller population at the time. So this is actually a very high number to have this many accidents. And that was from 1880 to 1900. But perhaps more alarmingly were the 536,000 who were injured. And you have to remember, at this time, there was no workers' compensation. There's no unemployment. If you get injured, you just can't work, right? And you're destitute unless you have somebody you can rely on to help support you. So this was a very serious problem. When you look at the unemployment rate, it's actually quite high, running double what would be, say, typical unemployment for full employment nowadays. If you look at the income, you'll get over 90% of people, 90% of American families, I should say, it's not just individuals, they're bringing home about $380. Well, that was well below the poverty line at the time. So over 90% of people are making substandard wages that they can barely support themselves or their family on. In 1900, with all that mass wave of immigration, there wasn't great housing for them when they came. So you would have people living in tenements. So this would be like, you could think of, being in the Lower East Side of Manhattan in an apartment that's 300 square feet, and there are 10 people living in that apartment, right? And this was common, and that's 2/3 of New Yorkers were living in those types of arrangements at that time. Before 1920, about 1 in every 4 non-farm children under 14 were working full-time. So child labor was common. And, of course, those children also were subject to these workplace accidents. And before the 1930s, less than half of Americans received more than a grade school education. So there was not compulsory education across the country as there is now. And this graphic here is a throwback to when I was talking about the Pullman Strike. So there's Pullman himself, right? And you can see he's squeezing, that's why I use that term, squeezing, right, these workers with the low wages and the high rent. And of course, that's what led to the Pullman Strike. But there were several other very notable strikes during this time period. So this was a common occurrence. And these strikes were often deadly. So in the Pullman Strike, if I recall correctly, at least 40 people lost their lives in that strike. So the progressives respond to this. So these are the conditions that lead to the progressive era. So we had an untenable situation. It just couldn't last, right? There was a lot of unrest. People were unhappy. And they were starting to turn to even more radical forms of politics as well, right? So during this time, Wall Street was bombed, right? There were anarchists. This is a crazy time period in U.S. history when you start to actually read through and look at it. And who comes to the fray is to kind of lead the progressives at the national level, and we're going to get to Wisconsin, don't worry, right? But at the national level is Teddy Roosevelt. And this was kind of by accident. He was VP, and the president was shot and assassinated. And they had actually given Roosevelt the VP position because they wanted to quiet him, right? He was such a he was such a charismatic, loud, and very intelligent, right? Brilliant man who also had very strong opinions about progressive politics. And he was in the Republican Party, which at this time was divided between the progressive faction and the conservative faction, right? And he was part of the progressive faction. So he accidentally becomes president. He's the youngest president at that time to have ever been in office. He's only in his 40s when this happens. And one of the things that he does is expand social welfare. So the idea being that we need to figure out a way to redistribute some of this vast wealth that is being held by this small number of wealthy industrialists. So they implement, over time, the progressives over time implement a federal income tax. And they start to redistribute more of the tax revenue, right? So that it's benefiting the public good, just not just the private good of these wealthy people. And he was a very strong proponent, for example, of inheritance taxes, believing that just because your parents had worked hard and, became exceptionally wealthy doesn't mean the children should just inherit all of that, right, when they did nothing to get that money. So he had very strong opinions and things like that. He also did not believe that we should allow these large trusts or these large monopolies to exist. So we should break them up because when there's a monopoly, it distorts the market mechanism, right? They're able to charge what they want. They're able to pay their workers what they want. But if there's competition, that's much better, right? It's like instead of just having one shipping company, we have UPS and FedEx. And that's a much better arrangement because they compete for workers, right? And they also compete for customers. And so everyone benefits from that arrangement as opposed to just one large company being in charge of it. And the idea here was not like what the socialists were arguing at the time, right, which was to wrest control of these resources and put them in the hands of the government. The progressives instead said, no, we just need better regulation. So we need capitalism, but we need it to be fair, right? We need it to work better for the people because capitalism works, but it has these issues that need to be dealt with, like the inequality that it naturally generates, right, if it's left to its own devices. And the corruption. So they were very keen on doing something about the corruption. So they put into place a lot of new policies. So they regulated railroads. The railroad companies during this time were well known to be a pretty corruptive when it came to politics, right? So in fact, they would give, for example, legislators free passes on the railroad. Now, at that time, that was a heck of a perk, right? So this would be like you getting free Ubers now, I guess, would be the modern-day equivalent. But getting a free bus ride to wherever, right? Or, free plane ride, for example, right? To anywhere, anytime you want to go. That was what they would do. So, they tried to clamp down on these railroads. They had the Antitrust Act to kind of break up these monopolies. We had the Pure Food and Drug Act, and of course this is not coincidentally that it happens in the same year as Upton Sinclair's novel, very famous novel, The Jungle, which wrote about the disgusting conditions of the meatpacking industry in Chicago and how they would bleach the meat and rats would fall into the pile and they would just grind them up with the meat. I mean, it was disgusting, right, when you read this. And so people were outraged. And this is where we get the FDA. So again, progressives want efficient, smart regulation that works on behalf of the public good, right? So keep that in mind. That's kind of one of their key philosophies that guides them. Meat Inspection Act, 16th Amendment, where we have the federal income tax. Now, this was, of course, not one of their most popular ideas. It was the income tax, right? But again, it was the only way to try to get the money from the wealthy and redistribute it in some form to the working class. You have the Federal Trade Commission. You also have the Child Labor Act. The Supreme Court ends up ruling that unconstitutional, but they definitely wanted to try to do something about the child labor issues. Now, lastly, I put it off on its own, but another big thing of theirs was also they wanted to do some electoral reforms. So prior to this amendment to the Constitution, the 17th Amendment, senators were chosen by state legislatures. And that was known to be a very corrupt process. So very large financial interests in the state would often have sway in that decision. And then the senators that were chosen would be beholden to these large, powerful interests in their state. And so they wanted to break that connection by having the people themselves directly elect their senators. Okay, so let's bring it back to Wisconsin, right? I mean, that is the point of the lecture. We got to get there at some point. So all of this is happening nationally. You know, we now have the context, the stage, the stuff that's happening. But there was a lot of movement in Wisconsin at this time. And in fact, Wisconsin was seen as being one of the premier examples of progressivism at the time. And a very famous book was written by Charles McCarthy, and it's actually called The Wisconsin Idea. It was published in 1912. And in it, he talks about how monopolies and very concentrated wealth interests had kind of captured power. And so the state needed to take power back, and there were some ways that it could do that. One would be removing money from politics, so taking wealth out of elections. Yeah, I know you're going to see that many of the ideas actually are still being debated and talked about today that the progressives came up with, right? These actually are old ideas that are still being debated to this day. Shackling of monopoly, you know, and you could think of talking about is Google, right, a trust that needs to be broken up, right? There's discussions about these big tech companies now. So all of this, what is old is new, right? And taxing the rich. Well, of course, we continue to talk about these issues as well. They wanted efficient scientific government, and this was, again, one of the key tenets of progressives. And so they wanted expert help and administration that should be freely recognized, and people trained for it in our colleges should be used in our government, right? And so we saw a lot of controversy related to this during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And who we should get our advice from, who should be staffed in the government to deal with that pandemic, right? All these kinds of issues. Emphasize the need for good governance, and so they wanted nonpartisan commissions. So they wanted fewer positions that were patronage-based, right, that are based on party affiliation. They wanted more positions that were like civil service and based on your merit, right? And they also talked about the Wisconsin idea for the university system, which is probably where you're more familiar with hearing that phrase, the Wisconsin idea, right? That's certainly something that was discussed at the time by, say, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, right? It was through its extension offices and other things. And that fits with this idea as well, which is that the university should serve the state and all of its people, right? Not just those who are going there or the researchers who are doing the research, right? It should serve the state and all the people. And so we have a progressive champion in Wisconsin who you probably have heard of before, and that's Bob La Follette, okay? And he was known as Fighting Bob. And Fighting Bob really had not just a statewide presence, but also he was on the national stage as well. And it's no coincidence that UW-Madison, right, that's the La Follette School of Public Affairs for their graduate programs in public service, right? It's obviously named after the La Follettes. So he served as governor, and then he most notably served as a U.S. senator, where he was seated for a couple decades. And he led for a time period during his time in the Senate, he actually led a coalition of progressive Republicans, at least a dozen or so. And so they would need to come to him to get votes, right? So he became a very important person, as you might imagine, when the Republicans wanted to get legislation through. Why did he become a progressive? Well, there's this really fascinating story that in 1891, when he was in the House of Representatives at this time, he was approached by a fellow Republican, a senator, and this senator had a case that was being heard that La Follette's brother-in-law happened to be the judge in the case. And so this senator said, well, here's $50 as a retainer, and then once the case is decided the right way, there'll be more for you, right? So it was a bribe. And La Follette saw it as such. And he angered a lot of his colleagues because he talked about it, right? He laughed. He was so upset. He actually talked about it. It ended up in the newspapers, and so it became a very embarrassing thing for Sawyer, the senator who, was a part of this. Who, of course, denied everything. That never happened. but this is what really was kind of the key moment in which he decided that the government is broken, right? It's not working on behalf of the people. It's working on behalf of powerful interests or self-serving interests of the people in these offices, right? And so we've got to do something about that. We've got to change that. Now, as you might imagine, I already mentioned this story. You see that he had no qualms about getting into disagreements with his colleagues, right, or exposing them when he thought they were wrong. And so there was a lot of infighting between the conservatives in the party and the progressives. He also ended up in some confrontations with a fellow progressive as well, a very well-known one, Teddy Roosevelt, and I'll talk about why, right, what the falling out there was. But first, this is an amazing thing that we have. We have him doing a campaign speech, and this is from the mid-1920s. So this is kind of brand new technology where they were able to record video and sound. So it's actually quite amazing that we have any footage of him with sound, right? And now you can hear his oratory skills.
America is not made. It's in the making. It has today to meet an impending crisis, menacing as any in the nation's history. It does not call a sound to arms, but it is nonetheless a call to patriotism and to higher ideals in citizenship. The patriotic citizenship of the country must take its stand and demand of wealth that it shall conduct its business lawfully, that it shall no longer furnish the most flagrant examples of persistent violation of statutes while invoking the protection of the courts, that it shall not destroy the equality of opportunity, the right to the pursuit of happiness guaranteed by the Constitution, that it shall keep its powerful hands off from legislative manipulation, that it shall not corrupt, but shall obey the government that guards and protects its rights. Mere passive citizenship is not enough. Men must be aggressive for what is right if government is to be saved from those who are aggressive for what is wrong. There is work for everyone. The field is large. It is a glorious service. This service for the country. The call comes to every citizen. It is an unending struggle to make and keep government representative. Each one should count it a patriotic duty to build at least a part of his life into the life of his country, to do his share in the making of America according to the plan of the fathers.
So he was obviously well known for his speaking skills, and he loved to do public speaking events, and this made him very popular, as you might imagine. So everywhere he'd go, he'd give a speech, right? Okay, but why do you have this falling out with Teddy Roosevelt? What happened there? And there's an interesting story that's a Wisconsin connection to this as well, so I'll talk about that. But Roosevelt served from 1901 to 1909, and the tradition at the time, it was not a constitutional amendment preventing a president from seeking a third term, right? This is what happened with FDR, right? He actually ended up serving more than 2 terms. But because of tradition, he decided that he would only serve 2 terms. And then William Howard Taft became president, a Republican, and he was no progressive. And so this really upset the progressive wing of the Republican Party, who felt betrayed by Taft. And La Follette was seen as the one who was going to run for president in 1912. But guess who decided to throw in his hat? Teddy Roosevelt. And so the two of them had a major falling out over this, right? Because La Follette thought it was going to be him who was going to be leading the progressives. And then once Roosevelt joins, he creates his own party, right? He doesn't even run as a Republican. He runs as the Bull Moose Party, which, what a great name, right? The Bull Moose Party. And, big hunter, Roosevelt was. But I just have to, this little story real quick is just the Wisconsin connection for Roosevelt. He was in Milwaukee giving a speech, and he was shot. He was shot. Someone tried to assassinate him. And his speech was so thick, the paper, and he also had his eyeglass case there, that it didn't actually, the bullet didn't go through, right? He just got basically a flesh wound, right? Because this, again, see the size of that. He had it folded up, too, so see the size of that speech. Again, another person known for their oratory skills, right? And so he survives, and then as he says, people are just taken aback. He's just been, gunshots have just gone off. They get the person who's tried to shoot him. And then he continues to give the speech. He gets back up to the podium and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." And he finishes the speech. So a very interesting person. And it's too bad, right, that the two of them, La Follette and Roosevelt, had this falling out, because obviously the progressives probably could have accomplished a lot more had the two joined forces instead of being at odds with one another. But all politics is local, as they say, right? And so it wasn't to be. But if you look at the Bull Moose Party platform, my goodness, there's things on there that are quite progressive, right, even for the time, and things that we still talk about today. So they had women's suffrage. Well, I think women's rights is something that's still being discussed. Taxes on inheritance. Yep, that's still being discussed. Raising the minimum wage, right? We're actually creating one at the time, but raising it is what we talk about now. Formation of a national health service. Oh, my goodness, right? That's certainly been debated over and over. Prohibition of child labor. Thankfully, that one has been solved. Right? That's not something we worry about these days. Limiting the power of large corporations and trusts. Again, an ongoing issue, right, that is still debated to this day. And also environmental issues, right, was another part of their platform. But La Follette does get his chance. It took all the way to 1924, though. Okay. So in the interim, we had Woodrow Wilson, who was a progressive, and a number of Republicans were divided on this, right, whether to support Wilson or not, because he did espouse many of the progressive ideals they believed in. But Wilson ran on re-election, right? His first term, he kept everyone out of World War I, right? And so his slogan for his re-election was, "He kept us out of war." But not within just a few months of him getting reelected, we were in World War I, right? So this upset many of the progressives who felt that wars often have the poor fighting and the rich benefiting, right? So they didn't like, a lot of them were against war, which alienated, I will say, La Follette, right? So La Follette was very anti-war, and there were many who were upset with him about that, and he lost some support. But he eventually does get to run in 1924, and he runs on the progressive ticket, right? So they actually create their own third party, and this was the third highest vote getting for a third party in U.S. history. At the time, it was the second highest, after Teddy Roosevelt, of course, had run on the Bull Moose ticket. But only Ross Perot beats this as well, right? Which by a small margin, actually. And Ross Perot didn't even carry any states. Well, La Follette did, but he only carried one, as you can see which one it is there. It's Wisconsin, of course. He carried his home state. Oops. Oh, gosh. What did I hit? Oh, it's back. Thank goodness. Okay. So he carried Wisconsin here, as you can see. He also had a pretty large number of counties voting for him along in here. So he was very popular in the upper mid. Progressive ideals were very popular in the upper Midwest and in the West. And you can see this election, well, those fault lines are pretty obvious. This is basically the Confederacy, right? The former Confederacy, I should say, obviously. The former Confederacy. And this is the North, right? And so that's kind of the fault lines that were for this election. And they did get a pretty good showing, though. The progressives got 16.5% of the popular vote. That's pretty respectable for a third party. And this was a coalition of progressives, and also some of the socialists threw in their support behind the progressives, and then some of the labor parties and other things, right, threw their support behind this as well. So it was a unique coalition of like farmers and working class laborers, right? But it basically, that coalition, as you might imagine, all of those diverse interests, which is the same issue that the Democrats have these days, right? They're kind of a tent party with all these different coalitions, and they try to hold them together. Well, it didn't work for the progressives, right? Basically, the party falls apart after this. They couldn't hold all those varied interests together. But at the state level, they had a lot of successes. So there were a number of major reforms in the state of Wisconsin traceable to La Follette and others, right, who were at times dominant in the state politics. And Roosevelt had this very nice thing to write. It kind of reminds me of like Hamilton and Burr, right, where they write those, they seem like very nice letters to each other, but they obviously hate each other. It's another one of these, you're still gentlemen, right? So they still write these nice, praiseworthy things about each other. But Teddy Roosevelt wrote this saying, thanks to the movement for genuinely democratic popular government, which Senator La Follette led to overwhelming victory in Wisconsin, that state has become literally a laboratory for wise experimental legislation aiming to secure the social and political betterment of the people as a whole. And so what did they accomplish? Well, factory conditions were made safer, so they had more regulation on working conditions in factories. They had one of the first workers' compensation programs in the nation. So before this, you'd have to try to sue your employer. And as you might imagine, they had way more legal resources and money, right, to fight those battles than you did. So the deck was stacked against workers trying to get workers' compensation claims. They instituted a program that allowed workers to get those claims. A state income tax was established. And again, the reasoning behind it was so that they could redistribute some of the wealth. Primary elections were put in the hands of voters rather than party bosses, so we see some of this electoral reform. We had the state's park system, right? So environmentalism was often a platform that was part of progressives. And they actually ended up, after La Follette's death, the La Follettes themselves remained very active in Wisconsin politics. And the Wisconsin Progressive Party was founded, so this was a state political party. And they had some excellent successes in 1932, 1934, but then the Democrats and the Republicans kind of unify and basically wipe them out in the 36 election, and they're kind of off the stage at that point, right? It's in the 40s they actually kind of formally disband the party. So, but for a time, there was a Wisconsin Progressive Party, and it clearly was traced to the La Follette family, right, in that legacy. Okay, so where are we now? How has the Republican Party in Wisconsin shifted? Well, it's certainly fascinating. The Republican Party is part and parcel of Wisconsin, right? It was founded in Ripon, Wisconsin, 1854. These were the former Whig Party members who were opposed to slavery, and they came together and formed a party that would have a more activist federal government that would seek to stymie the spread of slavery, right, and to end that institution. So Republican Party being the progressives in Wisconsin is not too surprising, right? Because again, the Republican Party was so dominant that if you wanted to be in state politics, you probably, say in this time period, you really wanted to be a Republican, right? That was the only way to really get elected and have an influence in Wisconsin politics. Okay, so nowadays, of course, we're far more divided than that, right? There's not one dominant party. It goes back and forth between Democrats and Republicans these days. And the party is now solidly conservative. There's just no question about that, right? There's no progressive wing of the current Republican Party in Wisconsin. there may be a few moderates, right? That's about it. They're certainly not progressive, though, like what we would have seen back in this time period 100 years ago. And so just to take some examples from some of the things that Scott Walker did, so this way I can talk about a former governor, right? I don't have to worry about talking about existing stuff. But so Scott Walker, when he came into power, he was kind of like the very well known nationally, even, right, for the things that he was doing in Wisconsin. But it wasn't the progressive policies, right? It was the conservative policies that he was putting in place that made the news and, kind of were seen as being what the Republican Party, the direction it would be moving in the future, right? Definitely not progressive, right? Moving more conservative. And so some of the things that they did, they had these tax breaks that benefited wealthy and big manufacturers. That's something, obviously, LaFollette and other progressive Republicans would have opposed, right, that they would not have been in favor of. Any catering to large business interests is something the progressives would have seen as corrupt, right? So they would not have been in favor of the Foxconn deal. They certainly would not have been in favor of the iron mine, the mining bill, right, that was basically written by lobbyists from GTAC, right? And then you have like the Act 10 and right to work laws. Progressives were on the side of the working class, on the side of unions, right, and things like that. So they would have been opposed to those ideas as well. There was an attempt at one point to strip the Wisconsin idea from the UW system. Well, as I mentioned, the Wisconsin idea was kind of part and parcel to the progressive movement, right? I mean, this was one of their key tenets, and so they would have obviously been very opposed to that. Regulatory expertise, right, was something they also stressed, having people based on their merit and not on patronage. This made the news when Walker tried to appoint that Brian DeShawn, who was a son of a lobbyist, right, who had given a lot of money to the Walker campaign and tried to put him in charge of regulatory affairs. It didn't end up happening because it made such a big scandal, right? But that, again, is something progressives would have been absolutely opposed to. Or some of these electoral things that have happened, like eliminating the Government Accountability Board, which is definitely, seems like something the progressives would have come up with, right, actually, was this type of board that was nonpartisan, right, to oversee elections. But that was eliminated. There's been a lot of gerrymandering, things like that, things the progressive Republicans were not known for and were often cases usually opposed to. So where does progressivism in Wisconsin go today? Well, it's very unlikely it's going to come out of we'll get the questions in just a minute. Last slide here, so we're finishing up. So where do we go from here today? The likelihood of it coming out of the Republican Party again, at least in the current Republican Party, seems very, very unlikely, right? And we've certainly had this issue of national politics seeming to come down into the states, right? And even down to school boards, for goodness sake, right? So with the kind of that national hyperpartisanship, polarization, all the things that, really kind of unsettle people, filtering down, it seems unlikely that the Republican Party would be, a host to this kind of progressive faction again. It's just not a good fit for where the party is now. So it's more likely to come from Democrats, and that's because, well, where's the voting come from in Wisconsin for Democrats? Well, I think we all know, right? It comes from Madison, Milwaukee, and then a few other little places in the state, right? It's mostly from Madison and Milwaukee. And, Milwaukee, of course, at one time had socialist politics even, right? Socialist mayor and other things like this. So that's probably more likely we're going to find kind of a progressive faction in Wisconsin today. In 2021, there was this bipartisan proposal to bring ranked choice voting. And I'm not going to go into what ranked choice voting is if you don't know, but because it gets complicated pretty quickly, actually. But the idea being that you wouldn't necessarily just have Republican and Democratic primaries. You'd have a primary where you vote for 5 people, and they could be any party, right? And if you went to something like that, you could see the possibility there that maybe a third party now has a chance. And there has been this third party for example, Andrew Yang has the Forward Party that he's trying to put together. So there might be some, third party opportunities, movements. But we'll see, right? It'll be something that we'll just have to wait to find out, right? But it's so fascinating how this all comes back full circle, right? So many of the debates we're having today are some of the same debates they were having 100 years ago. So I don't know if that means it's progress or not, right? But certainly interesting nonetheless. Okay, well, my time is up, so I will leave it there, and I'll open it up to questions. I know we had at least one question.
Sure. Let me bring the microphone over so everyone can hear. Okay.
What was that thing that was called the Wisconsin idea?
Ah, yes. Well, it depends if you're talking about it for the university system or if you're talking about it for politics, right? I gave you more of what the politics version of the Wisconsin idea was. That was Charles McCarthy's book, right? With the university, of course, it was that the university's bounds should be the bounds of the state, right? So the university is meant to serve all the people of the state. And it was really fascinating during this time period. They had the extension, which we all know of today, right? But at the time, they did far more than they do today. They taught people how to make cheese. They had debates that they would host on things like immigration, so really hot button political issues. So the extension was very much doing a lot of outreach to all the citizens at the time. And of course, public radio, right, comes out of UW-Madison, right? And so, so there's a lot of examples of what the Wisconsin idea is, and it's still alive today, right? It did not get stripped from that back during during those policy proposals.
No, the Fairhaven Lecture Series is one of UW-Whitewater's best examples of the Wisconsin idea, as a matter of fact. So, yeah.
At the time that this progressive movement was at its height, it was a Republican type of thing. But how much support did the ideas that they had get from the other side, from the Democrats, as it was?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so that's where you have Woodrow Wilson comes into play, right? So when he starts to espouse some of these progressive ideals, he's able to gather some of the support from Republicans, right, that were in the progressive faction. So yeah, that's right. I mean, it's like any popular movement, right? If that's where the people are, the votes are, the will of the people, right? You're trying to figure this out and you need to get elected. So they started to say some of the same things that were very popular with many of the people at the time, right? We see this all the time, right? Maybe less so nowadays, but certainly there was a time where you try to move towards the middle, right? Well, the middle in this case was a lot different than what the middle is today, right? People were interested in much more greater reforms at that time, right, than probably what would be tenable today.
Other questions? Okay, looks like we have a couple. Did you have one here? Did you put your hand up here? Did you have your hand up? Yeah, I can. Yeah, we'll go there and then up here.
I forgot my question.
Okay, we'll come back.
Happens to us all. That's fine. If you remember it, though, we'll come back.
So what, in your opinion, why is progressivism become such a dirty word?
Yeah, you mean
It is,
from this time period?
From then
To now.
Then to now.
Yeah.
There were all these wonderful things that have happened in this country and in the state. The word progressive is a dirty word in many circles today.
Yeah. It's probably because some of the policies they support nowadays maybe are a bit more controversial. And so I think at the time period you had this being a party supported a lot by working class folks, right? And there were far more of those at that time, people working in factories, say, than there are today, right? So the base is different of people who support progressive ideas. A lot of times you have, intellectual liberals in the cities being progressives nowadays, right? That's very different than what the progressives were at the time, right? Those were the leaders of the party, but those folks were definitely working on behalf of the working class, right, and their interests, and farmers and others, right, who were getting a raw deal out of the system that was really just benefiting a very small number of powerful interests. So the politics of things have shifted, right? And what progressives focus on now is a bit different than something that would maybe get a bit more of a consensus, like working conditions, right? Like people shouldn't get their hands chopped off when they're working the looms and the textiles, right? I mean, I think that's something everybody could say was, yeah, that's bad. Whereas today, you know, when you start talking about something like the Green New Deal, it really ruffles some feathers, right? To reorganize the economy, to tackle this really serious existential threat, climate change, right? But the way they wanted that was proposed became a flashpoint, right? Became controversial, and it was seen as government overreach. So this is, you know, a little bit different view than perhaps back then. So the issues were different, and you know, the country's perhaps maybe just a bit more conservative than it was then, right? I don't want to speak too much on that, but it's probably, if you look at this, you know, because it's hard to get any type of surveying of public opinion from 100 years ago, but it just seems like there was more acceptance of some more radical ideas than there would be today, right?
It seems to me that many of the policies that you talked about as progressive are now held by the Democratic Party. Would you call the Democratic Party of today a progressive party, or is it somewhat different or a lot different? Or?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you remembered it. But I think they have the same issue that the Republicans had, right? This strange marriage of these very much progressive people in their party, like a Bernie Sanders, say, right? Look at what happened in 2016 when the progressive part of the party challenged the establishment, right? The more mainstream establishment Democrats. Well, the mainstream establishment Democrats won, right? They beat out the progressives, even though Sanders fought it all the way to the nomination, right? So that infighting, yeah, it's still there. It's just now in the Democratic Party instead of the Republican Party, right? So the progressives are still fighting, but it's that they're now in the Democratic Party and they're fighting with the establishment of the Democrats as opposed to the establishment Republicans, where it was 100 years ago. So it's been a fascinating shift.
Other questions? I did want to remind everyone that we don't have a lecture next week, Monday, but next week, Thursday, Jonah's colleague Eric Lepp will be doing a lecture on third parties and the third party system, and that's going to be Thursday night at the Community Engagement Center. So if this topic interests you, we can offer that for next week. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking Dr. Jonah Ralston and ask
everyone.
questions if you have them. Thanks, everybody.